All right, very good. All right, welcome everyone. We good? Look at Bobby, he's the real director of things here. Look, it's lovely to be here. Actually, I can stand over here for a moment. I mean, genuinely, I know people say it's a pleasure to do these things, but actually it really, really is. It's wonderful. Celebrate a fantastic human being, a fantastic institution brought together. So I'm going to make just 5 minutes of remarks, well, less than 20. And then Michael's going to take you through his inaugural lecture. So it's my genuine pleasure to introduce Michael Sanders, who's going to talk about From Nudge to Shove, Adventures in Behavioural Science and Evidence-Based Policy, which for those in the know will realize that's both a nod towards the kind of behavioural science stuff, my kind of stuff, and the team, but also to, of course, another person connected here, Louise Casey, Shove. That was her line, right, is that we'd come along and do the gentle, nice stuff, the nudge, and if that didn't work, you'd get her in and she'll do the proper shove, or just write you a review, of course, obviously. So it's going to bridge between that particular divide as well. Michael is the director of the School of Government, now in one of Europe's largest now, most dynamic communities for social research, which includes both the Faculty of Social Science and the Policy Institute at King's. And it's good to see also, I see former directors here, along as well as Bobby at the back. I think they exemplify what Michael's work stands for, which is tackling real-world problems through evidence, working across disciplines, and in a kind of meaningful partnership with government and civil society. There are lots of institutions which do have that sort of sense of interdisciplinary written on the door, but the question is, in academia, let's face it, it's often quite hard to do. I was reflecting, standing up here when I was first a lecturer in my faculty at Social and Political Science in Cambridge, and it was interdisciplinary, a wonderful institution in lots of ways, but it didn't necessarily have common purpose. And I think the great thing about schools of public policy is that they introduce a common purpose, which does then break down genuinely between disciplines. And it's a great thing, not just for the world, but actually also for academia and thinking. So Michael is the former chief scientist at the Behavioural Insights Team, which I myself spent time at, and also former CEO of the What Works Children's Social Care, Centre for Social Care, which kind of embodied the two bits of what I'm sure Michael will talk about, behavioural science and also what works or the use of evidence, both those things. So Michael's been personally involved in literally hundreds of those trials over time. It says here 600. I believe Michael's good with numbers, so that's presumably true. But I just tiny bit of it. I mean, I met Michael many years ago in the early days of when we had the Behavioural Insights Team in split between number 10 and Cabinet Office, and we had the bright idea of wouldn't it be good to bring some PhD students in to supplement what we would do, which ESRC very kindly funded. And so we had a bunch of these PhD students who would turn up, one of whom was this young guy called Michael Sanders. And he was doing a PhD on encouraging giving. Well, for those who remember at the period, so circa 2012, 2013, we had this tail end of the big society and how would we encourage giving and could we make that a proposition too? Fortunately, we had a PhD student who wanted to do work on that. So a marriage made in heaven. And it also seemed to work for Michael, right? I think he can tell you his own story, I'm sure in a minute. But as an academic PhD turning up in some company, can I run an experiment how we get your employees to give more? I think generally it was like, yeah, nice idea, come back another 10 years. But it turned out actually coming from Cabinet Office and number 10 with a PM who was interested in it, made it easier to progress those policies. And indeed, Michael then went on to do a series of really fantastic bits of work around how you could in fact prompt and encourage people to give more. I mean, unfortunately, big society might have gone down the pan, but those experiments were still really, really good and worth looking at if you're ever interested in the question about how do you encourage people to give more. Michael's role, of course, expanded and became this, for Michael, his unique combination, and particularly his methodological capabilities to make him chief scientist at BIT, following partly the government role of chief scientist. It would be really good to have those kind of people who could bridge into the world of ideas and be particularly rigorous on method too in the organization. I'll just tell one story from the period which embodies for me the kind of the essence of Michael. And so some of you may know the story, but we were doing more and more work in other parts of the world, including one of the places was very early to look out for us was Singapore. If you do anything interesting in government, someone from Singapore will turn up and say, that's really neat, can you tell us about it? It's an incredible attribute actually to have in a government, to be outward looking in the way that Singapore is. Anyway, so I'd gone over there in circa 2014, 15 a few times. And one of the things I've noticed, they were doing amazing work already with machine learning. So they'd already got applications running. So you could call up an inquiry to their tax the tax authority, and then you can ask a question. They would actually try and answer. Like, am I allowed to give the following thing? HMRC, listen in. And they were using machine learning models to try and answer these questions and have a feedback loop. They're also using, for example, in the management of their transport systems, to use machine learning model and figure out where should you direct the bus or turn the lights on, etc. So it's very cool. So I came back and I had lunch with my old wonderful colleague, the late Jeremy Hayward, and we talked about various things. And one I was like, hey, Jeremy, I think we should do this thing. It's really cool what Singapore's doing. Why don't we do it in British government? Let's do some machine learning. And Jeremy was always up for these things. He's like, yeah, great. Let's set up a team of 6 people. We've got only tiny team in BIT, but we're putting 2 people, including Michael. And then ONS will give us 2 people, and GDS will give us 2 people. And it'd be fabulous. We'll have 6 people like Bloomberg did their data stuff. Well, cut a long story short, it turned out no one else turned up for the party. ONS, like, yeah, right, we're too busy. GDS, what are you talking about? So it was like, well, we can't really do this. With 6 people, it was going to be mad anyway. But 2, it's just nuts. And Michael's like, no, we'll have a go anyway. I'm like, yeah, right. Many of you might have this experience in life. You sometimes have a discussion with someone, you think this would be a good idea, but you don't really think it'll happen. It was definitely in that this isn't going to happen bucket. Anyway, of course, Michael goes and does it. He hires this fantastic guy. He knows what he's talking about, etc. Give it, 9 months in or so, comes back with half a dozen machine learning models. Really beautiful stuff. 2016, 17, well ahead of the curve. Absolutely superb. So that was just definitely in the bucket of this will never happen into, oh my God, he actually did it. That is Michael to a T. And the What Works Centre, of course, now also foundations, as it's gone on to be. I think he's embedded in a similar way, trying to bring together methods in a very difficult environment, political in a different way, with social work, who might not even be happy about the idea of experiments at all. Can you make that work? And of course, it's gone on strength to strength. We should all be proud of institutions, Michael, that we are no longer part of, but are still going strong. I think it's a really good thing, and that would be in that market. Just kind of draw to close, really. On a personal note, Michael's been open about this, but Michael's probably had more wrestling with life than many of us. And he also doesn't have a second, or first or second gear, right? With Michael, you're gathered. He's just like, let's do this at 5,000 miles a year, which generally works, but doesn't always. But fantastic, energetic, incredible person to work with. Of course, Michael, you embody, for me, what I think we were often trying to do in BIT and the more innovative bits of government, which is to bring together scholarship with public service and actually being an entrepreneur, which you also did. And you did even before you came to BIT in publishing and elsewhere. And I think also that's what King's is trying to do in the Policy Institute in a similar way and bring those together. And King's more generally. And just a final remark on that with respect to King's. So, careful what you wish for. Michael is fantastic. You'll also, I'm sure, disrupt the institution in good ways too. I and some other people in the room on the King's Impact Leaders Board, and King's wants to do these amazing things in the world, save the planet, etc., etc. But you also say, what is the comparative advantage of an institution like this? What is here within a mile of where we are standing? And just look at it, right? We're within a mile of government and all the major institutions of the state. They're there, right? We're within a mile of the city and all those financial institutions. We're at the edge. If you got north, you've got the crick and the buzzing science, but also poverty and disadvantage. There's some stuff to the south as well. I'd be darned if I could think of it. Borough Market definitely is that way. But that's what's here, and King's is literally the closest, certainly, to government. So to be able to do what Michael does brilliant and the institution does brilliantly, to bring together, as I said, that sort of combination scholarship, public service, entrepreneurial activities. The last thing I just noticed, I was delighted. I had a quick read of the King's statute before doing this, just to clarify what we really are here for. To advance education and private research for public benefits. He's a pretty good core to it. I was also delighted to read that staff employed by the university shall have the freedom within the law, I love that, to question and test. Now, Michael really knows what that means, literally, not just metaphorically or loosely. Receive wisdom, and that's what you should do. I also love that it has this little bit, you're allowed to put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinion without placing themselves in jeopardy of losing their jobs or privileges. So Michael, you've already got the job, go crazy, be controversial. Tell us about From Nudge to Shove. Thank you. Okay, one more, David.
Where do you want to be?
I'm going to go down there because I can see your slides better.
Yeah. So this is good because David has no poker face. So if you're ever sitting in an audience where David's on a panel and he doesn't like what the other person on the panel is saying, there is a very particular face which, if you've known David for a long time, screams, "This guy is an idiot." And I really don't need to be seeing that while I'm speaking, because he's given me such a nice introduction. The point about not having a first or second gear, I've only very recently learned to drive, to the astonishment of my family in my late 30s. And like, people have always been like, "Why can't you drive? You should learn to drive." I'm like, well, you can't solve a Hamiltonian. So when you learn to do that, I'll learn to drive. Still, they haven't, but I can drive now. And one of the things I've learned is if you try and start a car in third gear, it really doesn't like it. And there's a screeching noise that you can hear from the engine, which is a noise that I am quite familiar with from institutions. So I'm very grateful to the institutions I've been part of for tolerating the screeching noise and the occasional sort of smell of smoke emerging from something until we get up to speed, and then everything's sort of fine. So I'm going to talk about stuff. So in the beginning, so David has already given a bit of background. So I was born in Somerset, in North Somerset, which is, for those of you who work in the British government, it's the bit that's not London and it's not the north. There's a whole other bit of the country with problems. I would encourage you to visit, but unfortunately getting a train there will take you most of the week. There's a motorway. It's great. But you all live in London, so when I said I know how to drive, you all consider this to be deeply unrelatable. You could ride a bike there. It will take a very long time. I did it last year. Not to be recommended. Don't go on a towpath on a Brompton for 60 miles if you really like your spines or other parts of your anatomy. So that's where I was born. And then I went to school. I went to what is affectionately known as a bog standard comprehensive. It was so good that a few years after I left, the BBC made a 3-part documentary about how bad it was. At the end of episode 3, the head teacher quits on camera. High drama. So I went to that school. While I was at that school, I had a friend who, when we were 16, we did our GCSEs, and he got the same grades as me, which is to say, pretty average. I am a very average student. I'm going to immodestly say, because this is my talk, that I'm a pretty good researcher, very average student. My friend was also an average student, possibly slightly above average. He got the same grades as me. He dropped out of school at 16. And the reason he did that was because his family needed him to go and work in order to earn an income in an industry that it turns out is dying, but he had to go and do that, which meant that he didn't have the opportunity that I've had to go to university to progress and to do the things that I've done. This isn't to say, because I always get this at talks, it doesn't say that university is for everybody. I know the Department for Education is very keen that we don't tell anybody that they must go to university because that'd be scary. Whatever. He should have had the opportunity to go to university. And when people say not everyone should go to university, they are almost never talking about their children. And when they say we mustn't tell people that some universities are better than others, and then you say, where did you go? Usually one of two. Get the occasional person who went to the LSE if you're hanging around the analytical community. You get also in the analytical community, you get people who call themselves economists, PPE. So I think you're a third of an economist. So like echo, insofar as you're really good at like repeating what somebody told you 15 years ago. Anyway, that wasn't what I was planning on saying. So that's one of my friends. Another one of my friends, when we turned 18, she was made homeless pretty immediately. She spent the last 3 months of sixth form living in a Nissan Micra. I don't know if any of you have ever been inside a Nissan Micra. It's not really a living space. I think it's probably fair to say that wasn't the best way for her to spend the last 3 months of her education. Wasn't the best start to her life. So in general, what I'm going to talk about over the course of the next however long it takes me to get through my slides is going to be about numbers, and it's going to be about bar charts. But the genesis of this is in people. When I talk about people, when I talk about numbers, I'm talking about people whose lives are affected by what is often, for most of us, a collective failure to do our jobs. And to do our jobs at a pace that is meaningful. Every year, 750,000 children turn 18. Tens of thousands of those will have experienced children's social care in one form or another, with all that that entails. Thousands of those will go on to experience homelessness, substance abuse, mental health issues, and all the rest. Every year, we don't have a strong evidence base to support these people. We are failing every single one of those children. I'm not going to do the Bob Geldof thing and click, because I don't know how fast it happens, and I have no rhythm. But that's why we need to do the things I'm going to talk about. So that's the beginning. I then went off to the University of Reading, which for some reason has as its logo 3 shells, despite, if anybody's ever seen Reading, not very seaside-y. False advertising. And then I went to some other places, and then I made the biggest mistake of my life, which was I met David. And if you can see a before and after picture, there's something up here. And then almost immediately afterwards, there isn't. Whereas David, if you Google, not while I'm talking, David Halpin's Sydney Morning Herald, there is a picture of David in front of what I believe is a self-portrait, which is a surrealist self-portrait, because David literally has a portrait in his attic, which is why he hasn't aged in the time I've known him. And then I did some other things. And what we see here is I'm very bad at having one job at a time. And I'm interested in almost everything where I can do something with numbers or people, which is actually quite a lot of things. Which means when you come to construct a lecture in which you're going to put together the narrative of your work, you can't really, because there is no narrative to my work. I just wander around trying to be helpful. And occasionally Leisure will call me and say, "Can you do this?" And I'll say, "Yes, of course I can." And then David will say something or somebody else, and I'll go around. That's the whole gig, basically. But I can't give a talk on that, because it would be, well, I'd be finished. I know you wish I was finished, but I'm not. So here we are. So, as David said, I became a chief executive of What Works Centre, the What Works Centre for Children's Social Care. This was, for me, the job I had wanted for a long time. I care deeply about children's social care, I care deeply about what works, and I really wanted to be a chief exec. If you've ever watched the first 3 Star Trek films, maybe don't, if you haven't already. Certainly don't watch the odd-numbered ones. But the first 15 minutes of the first 3 Star Trek films are Kirk, who is now an admiral, finding an excuse to take back control of the Enterprise. And then at the end of Star Trek 4, after he's blown up the Enterprise, having nicked it, spoilers, I know, the film came out in the late 1970s, so if you haven't watched, maybe it's the 80s. If you haven't watched it, sorry. It's a good film, though. Anyway, and the punishment for this is he gets demoted from admiral to captain, and he gets given a new ship, which is, again, spoilers, the Enterprise A. I was not a very good chief executive. There are a number of reasons and a number of dimensions across which I was not a good chief executive. The one I'm going to talk about now is I didn't want to be a chief executive. I wanted to be a research director. I wanted to be in the chair, doing the regressions, finding the bar charts, thinking about trial design. And so the first half of any project was me trying to take back control of the Enterprise so that I could design the research. Like, oh, this is quite a complicated one. Did you know I've run 600 randomized control trials? I'll just step in. So I'm not a chief exec anymore. I have been demoted. I'm a research director. And I couldn't be happier about that. Over my career, I've had some wonderful mentors, and also David. I've also had a brilliant collection of fellow travelers, of people who have challenged me, and I haven't got space for all of you, challenged me to be better, to think differently. People who've said, have you ever thought about this policy area? Have you ever thought about this policy problem? Could we do trials in? And as David says, my answer is always, yes, of course we can. We'll work out how we're doing it on the way. But give me a little bit of money, and I'll make some trials happen for you. I've also the great privilege of being an academic, the greatest privilege of being an academic is supervising doctoral students, and many of my doctoral students are here. And so I've been so fortunate to have a wonderful collection of doctoral students who are interested in almost nothing that I'm interested in. And that means I get to expand my interest, right? So Eliza, to be fair, I was interested in your area. Emma, pensions? No. But I'm much more interested now. I know so much more about pensions than I did before. And that's the great privilege of doctoral supervision. You don't have to commit your entire life to it. Just like 4 years worth of intellectual capital, and that's nothing. Every 4 years, you get a brand new 4 years of intellectual capital. Use it wisely, supervise someone. Over the course of my career, I've been involved in 2 revolutions in the way that we do policymaking. The first is the rise of behavioral science. Those are some behavioral science people. And over the last 15 years, thanks to David and others, we have seen an enormous surge in the use of behavioral science in public policy. Starting with Cass in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs and with David in Cabinet Officer number 10, there are now thousands of teams around the world. If you'd like to read a book about some of them, my book, Outside the Nudge Unit, covers several of them. Don't. No. I'll send you a PDF. It's far too expensive. And there is no longer the same kind of skepticism that the team first encountered in government. People have bought into this idea. This stuff works. We've also seen the rise of randomized controlled trials, which is in part down to the Behavioural Insights Team. Part of the reason economists are no longer skeptical about behavioral science is because we proved that it made a difference. We spoke their language, the language of data. This has bled across into the creation of the What Works network. And you can see the bleeding across because David used to run both of these things simultaneously. And I was also there. These centres have made an enormous difference. And I know for many people who work in these centres or who work in government working on this, it can feel like a slog. But the difference that's been made is astonishing. So let's talk about some nudges. So my first big nudge was I gave investment bankers sweeties. We spent about £2.50 on a packet of sweets. And if you were an investment banker in a randomly selected office, we gave you a packet of sweets and asked you to give us £1,000 of donation. And this was back in 2012, so this was real money. And what we did was we doubled the rate at which they gave, from 6% to 12%. You might be concerned about the custodians of the global economy being quite so easy to trick, but the charities were pretty pleased. We also did a study where we got an inspirational couple of students, one called Ben, one called Rachel, to write letters out to young people who had good grades and went to schools where most people with good grades didn't go to good universities. We can argue about what good means later. We sent that out to 3/4 of 11,000 students. So a control group, 8.5% of them go to university, go to a selective university, sorry. Get both letters, goes up to 11.4%. It's a small increase on a graph. That's 330 children a year extra going to selective universities. That's 330 extra children a year having a route into the professions, into the civil service, into government, where they can make a difference by designing policies that match up to their lived experience, not the lived experience of some other people who went to other schools, which we won't name. We also, working with, among other things, my amazing colleague Michael Horsworth, we tried to tackle one of the biggest issues facing humanity. But between 2025 and 2050, it's estimated that 39 million people will die as a direct result of antimicrobial resistance and 170 million other deaths related to that. We worked with the then Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davis, who was both fortunate and unfortunate to be Chief Medical Officer when she was, so no one's ever heard of her. Chris Whitty, everyone's heard of? I'm not sure he'd trade that, but anyway. So we wrote out to the GP practices that were over-prescribing. We adjusted for their patient load, and we said, oi, you're over-prescribing. And one of the things about doctors that you don't get with teachers is they say, no, we're not. I'm a doctor, I know my maths. I'm prescribing less than my neighbors. It's like, yes, but we have adjusted for the fact that you don't have very many women on your patient list, and women need more antibiotics than men. And they're like, oh. We sent the letters out. We significantly reduced the number of antibiotics that are being prescribed. That allows us to have more time to develop new drugs. It slows down the pace at which antimicrobial resistant bugs grow. We did work led by my colleagues Roy Gallagher and Alex Gianni in job centres, completely redesigning the way that job centres did the initial part of enrolling somebody on benefits, tested it, and we significantly increased the rate at which people flow off of benefits. If you listen to David. That's millions of days of people not being on benefits being back in work. That's behavioral science. A large part of this credibility comes from these trials. It's not just I did a cool thing. It's not just I did a cool thing and then something good happened. It's a robust randomized control trial. Embracing this model of empiricism allowed us to be much more credible than we otherwise would have been. And it also allowed us to push into other policy domains and say, hey, if we're testing our letters, why aren't you testing your thing? Because our thing's just a letter. You're doing big policy. Why don't we test that? The promise of these trials is that we will find out what works and we will do it. This is how a randomized control trial works. On the off chance anybody has chosen to come to listen to me talk who doesn't know about this yet, we get a bunch of people. We divide them into two groups at random by flipping a coin or using a random number generator. We give the new thing to half of them and not to the other half. They're identical on covariates on average. And then we see what happens, and if the treatment group gets better and the control group doesn't, or they get less bad, it works. That's how the whole thing works. Biggest study that I was ever involved in funding when I was at What Works, £20 million for a 3-year randomized control trial placing social workers in schools. We wanted it to work. The DFE wanted it to work. Isabel Trowler, who's terrifying, Chief Social Worker for Children and Families for England, she wanted it to work. Does it work? No, it doesn't. So you might view that's £20 million wasted. I view it as £100 million saved by not continuing to do it. In education, the graph on the left is how big we thought effect sizes were in education before we started doing randomized control trials. These are massive effects. The graph on the right is how big effect sizes actually are in education when we start doing rigorous tests. These are small effects. Most things don't work as well as we thought they did. However, some things do work. An example of that is family group conferences, which we rigorously tested. We found out that they do work to prevent children entering care. That means government can invest in them, safe in the knowledge that it will have an impact. Body-worn video cameras for the police, they do work, they do have an effect. And lots of interventions in education do have an effect, just not all of them, and not always the one that you think is going to have the effect. These trials are positive. It's great that we've done them, but it has been our challenge, as anybody in this room who's ever done one will know. People don't instinctively feel that they're ethical. I'm 600 randomized control trials deep. I got an email yesterday from a partner for a trial who said, "Are you sure this is ethical?" Like, yes. I resisted the temptation to say, oh, it hadn't occurred to me that withholding an intervention, of course, the veil is lifted from my eyes. I will change profession. Ethnography only from here on. The work is difficult. It involves setbacks. Some of these things don't work. And by don't work, I mean the trials collapse. And it can take a long time. We often have to give people bad news. Your thing didn't work. Soz, I know you dedicated 20 years of your life to it, but you have to stop now. There is a temptation to find the easy route. Do we have to be that worried about counterfactuals? Do we have to be that worried about methods? Can't we just do a pre-post and hope nothing goes wrong? We've had one pandemic, we're not going to have another one, surely. There's a temptation to say, let's just roll these things out, they sound really nice. Or there's a temptation to move upstream, to find things where we can't test them and do those interventions instead. We must resist this temptation. This is folly. There are problems. The problem with nudges is that we are like people playing these games in an arcade. If you've never been to an arcade, I'm really sorry for you. There are some coins which are very close to the edge. You have to find the hole to put your coin in where it's going to push the most coins over the edge. Very rational, sound strategy. The problem is you ignore all of the holes where the coins aren't very close to the edge. You only push, when you put it through that hole, the coins that are very close to the edge. We only send to university those kids who've already got the good grades. All of the kids who don't have the good grades, all of the kids who are living in their Nissan Micra, our nudges aren't doing anything for them. And that's a problem. We also have a problem with scale. We have made a lot of claims about the impacts of our work. These claims are true, but they are only true if we deliver the interventions again and again and again, and we're actually pretty bad at that. This isn't a behavioural insights team problem, by the way. This is a public policy problem generally. We don't act on the evidence. That gives us an unkept promise of the evidence-based policy movement. Our impacts are only possible if the intervention gets scaled up. We do not do very well at that. And that means that our claims of cost effectiveness are substantially damaged because we're not scaling up enough. So, now on to the part where I stop being down in the dumps about things and we start talking about what we can do about it. So, the first bit is moving fast and fixing things. David has already said I quite like to move fast. As you're learning so far, I also like to speak fast. And I'm in favor of a kind of entrepreneurial spirit, right? We should do things. Let's try it, you know. No one who's ever worked with me has ever heard me say no to anything. So we should move fast, but we shouldn't be focused on profit, and we shouldn't be focused on, oh, I wonder if I can build an AI thing. We should be focused on how that stuff improves people's lives. Moving fast and fixing things at the same thing. We can do this even with a small team. You don't need 100 people. You barely need 5. An example of something where we were able to move fast was working with colleagues at the College of Policing on a step-wise randomized controlled trial testing a new intervention that aims to reduce use of force by police against members of the public. This is an area of deep importance. We built the trial quickly with colleagues. Rachel, hi. It was tested quickly. It was pragmatic. We got the results quickly. And now I think, Rachel, it's been rolled out. Right. So, very modest effects. But multiply that by the number of people who have contact with the police. Multiply that by the number of people who are no longer experiencing force by the police as a consequence. And by the way, it doesn't mean the police get hurt anymore. They're not standing there and taking violence. There's no effect on them. It's a pragmatic thing we can do quickly. We can make a real difference. We can work with our colleagues at the Centre for Homelessness Impact on quasi-experimental evaluations of interventions to reduce homelessness for care leavers, and we can do this quickly and cheaply by using the data that already exists and by deploying a very similar method across all of these evaluations, instead of trying to build the same evaluation over and over and over and over and over and over again. We can do this. This is coming out, if anyone's interested, 12th of February. Coming soon to a King's Day U. It's very exciting. Some of you may say that's not ochre. And to you, I say, shut up. But this ties into the industrialization of trials. At the moment, we are in a cottage industry of artisanal, hand-produced, randomized control trials. Guillermo's going to commission 5 randomized controlled trials. He's going to get 5 evaluators to look at them. We're all going to go away, think our big thoughts, go back to the same papers that we're all reading at the same time. Me and Susanna, in our own respective homes, reading the same paper. We're going to come up with a very similar design, but one that's slightly different. Let's not do that. Let's skip to the end of that. Let's produce trials from a template. Let's have an agreed way we're going to do them so we can lower the cost of doing them. Not a good business model, but it's probably good for society. We can also better use the data that already exists. This is one of my favorite projects that we ran when I was at Children's Social Care. EEF has spent hundreds of millions of pounds at this point on trials, testing, interventions. Hooray! But there's so much untapped potential because in these trials we have boy students and girl students. We have students who've got experience of children's social care. We have all of the diversity that is contained within our population. And all of these trials look at, and there's nothing wrong with this, overall effects and effects on young people eligible for free school meals. This is not the only kind of deprivation or disadvantage we have. I wanted to go into those trials that already existed and test whether they worked better or worse for young people with a social worker. When I was at BIT, I went to the DFE, and they said, this seems like it's EEF's job. I went to EEF, and they said, this seems like it's not our purview, and it's a bit academic. I went to the ESRC, and they said, oh, that's a bit applied. I had to literally become the chief executive of What Works Centre in order to find the £50,000 it costs to run this study. That's crazy, and I can't do that again. No one will have me. And Leisha seems like she's pretty much stuck in post, so I'm not going to... Over the last year, we've also launched a series of scaling projects. We've taken interventions that have been shown to work, which have got a good evidence base, and we are paying for them to be scaled up. We are using our own actual money. which we get from our much-loved private clients. Thank you, Leisha. Because this stuff is cheap. The whole promise of these interventions is they're cheap. So we're doing it ourselves because no one else will pay us. But we can have these impacts because the data exists. That's talking about trials. Now I'm going to talk about shove. I'm not going to pretend to be Louise Casey. I can't do that. I remember she came to BIT once and she called us all a word I won't say. Prefixed with privileged. Can't say that she was that wrong. But anyway. So some things I think need a shove. Many of the problems that we're fighting need more than a nudge. That isn't to say that we shouldn't do nudges. Right? Nudges are great. I love nudges. I've done so many of them at this stage. The impacts of something like poverty cut across many policy problems. Poverty is a strong predictor of almost everything that we're interested in. If you're a work centre for youth violence, poverty. Homelessness, poverty. Low educational attainment, poverty. Children on social care, poverty. All of these things are all credibly caused by poverty. The things that aren't caused by poverty, if you can find one, are made worse by poverty. And around we go. Intergenerational cycles of poverty. Poverty, harm, trauma, bad policy outcomes, poverty, and so on and so on. So the question is, what happens if we ignore Fleetwood Mac? What happens if we try and break the chain? I've got one Star Trek reference in there, and so I'm trying to balance. So we have worked with colleagues at a number of different funders, and thank you ever so much to everybody who's funded this thus far. I've said Alicia's name a lot, but I am very grateful. To run trials seeing what happens if we just give people some money. So I should say, Susanna has done the first one of these. I'm sort of slightly late to the party. And I haven't included yours in here, so you didn't think I was taking credit for your work. But we're running these trials around the country with different local authorities, with different partners, to see for what kinds of circumstances, if we give you money, does it make a difference? What size difference does it make? I don't believe it works. That's not my job. I'm not a priest. I wear a completely different kind of ridiculous thing around my neck. But if it does work, if we can find circumstances under which we have credible impacts from cheaply giving people money directly and trusting them, we can make a really meaningful difference. So to conclude, because you're all bored of me now. The moral arc of the universe bends slowly, but it does bend towards justice. I stole that from Martin Luther King, to be clear. And I'm saying that because I thought everyone knew, and I was at a meeting the other day, and I said it, and I goes, that was great. Can I use that? I'm like, sure, but just to be clear, of all the things to appropriate, that's not the one. The moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, but only if we push it really, really hard. We have to put our back into this work. We need to get better at picking the right tool for the right job. All of us, all the time. We need to get better at using trials and data to find out if we're on the right path, to find out if the things that we're doing, the things that we believe make a difference, see if they actually do. Because this is a place for work, not faith. We need to get better at following through. When we find out something works, we should shout it from the rooftops. We should do everything we can to make it happen. When we find out something doesn't, we should shout that from the rooftops, not be very quiet. And we need to get less patient. It is very easy when we are in nice, comfortable research jobs to say, it's okay, we'll do some advanced work. Not to be unkind, we'll do a systematic review. We'll spend 12 months thinking about whether or not there's any evidence for this thing. If you're thinking about doing a systematic review of whether or not there's any evidence, whether or not cash transfers work in the UK to affect meaningful social outcomes, there isn't any. Stop running the review. Run a trial. Do something. We must be less patient. We must be more urgent because things will not happen otherwise. And we must have in our head, every 12 months is 750,000 children losing their last chance at childhood and being set on a path that we do not like. And that is unacceptable. And that is the end of my song.